Okay, let's unpack this. We've been handed a pretty formidable stack of sources here,
Hmm,
and they all deal with a question that's, I mean, it's as old as civilization itself, but it feels more urgent than ever.
it really does.
What is the divine, the ethical, and even the biological purpose of humanity? And how does all of that connect to this mandate for our species to just continue?
That's the core challenge, isn't it? The sources you provided are, well, they're incredibly comprehensive. They don't just lean on one thing, like theology. They kind of create this three-legged stool of an argument.
Right.
So they weave together deep theological doctrines, specifically from the Abrahamic faiths, with these secular ethical
Like
systems.
utilitarianism and deontology.
Exactly. And then they anchor all of that to the undeniable realities of evolutionary biology and, frankly, current demographic collapse.
Absolutely. So our mission here is pretty clear. We need to distill the central unifying argument that runs through all of this material for you. And that argument, I mean, as it's framed here, is that the ultimate purpose of human existence is fundamentally tied to ensuring the continuation and the flourishing of the human race.
And we should probably set the expectation that the sources use this established mandate, this duty to survive, to explore a major contemporary conflict.
Hmm.
They specifically investigate whether non-procreative relationships like same-sex unions can be reconciled with what they're calling this divine, ethical, and biological necessity for long-term survival.
And we're just here to report on that,
Hmm.
impartially, on how these viewpoints conclude that procreation is, in fact, a moral duty essential for both biological and societal continuity.
And so,
So let's start at the very beginning of the argument presented in the source material, the theological foundation.
right.
Across a lot of these religious traditions, procreation isn't framed as, optional. It's a direct foundational divine instruction.
It's often highlighted as the first great commandment given to humanity. The sources, they repeatedly cite that directive from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 28, to be fruitful and multiply.
But the interpretation here is critical, isn't it? It's not just a mechanical instruction to, fill the earth.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's presented as a moral and a spiritual duty.
And if it's a spiritual duty, that carries, far more weight than just a biological instinct.
Precisely. Fulfilling this duty is argued to strengthen the community, to ensure the continuity of cultural and religious traditions. It kind of upholds the foundational covenant or relationship between the divine and humanity. It's an act of worship.
Not just an act of nature.
Exactly. It's an act of obedience.
It's fascinating how smoothly that religious duty then translates into shaping the very definition of the family unit itself.
Hmm.
In Christian theology, the sources really emphasize that marriage is defined specifically as a sacred institution where procreation isn't just a byproduct, it's a foundational purpose.
And they get very specific there. The documents cite the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which explicitly affirms that matrimony is, and I'm quoting here, ordained for the procreation and education of children.
So that framing suggests that the marital union, it extends far beyond just the emotional fulfillment of the two people involved.
Yes, it has an inherent functional responsibility to the species and to the
Mhm.
faith community to bring new life into the world and, guide them.
Okay, so that covers the divine mandate. But how does this translate when we sort of remove the explicitly theological parts? The sources argue you still reach the same conclusion.
You do. It translates because the goal shifts from, say, divine will to human flourishing
Mhm.
and the long-term continuity of civilization.
Okay.
We look at the two ethical frameworks they present. They both end up endorsing procreation, but for different reasons.
Let's start with utilitarianism. That's the greatest good for the greatest number. How does procreation fit into that calculation?
Well, the utilitarian argument presented is basically a long-term cost-benefit analysis. The greatest good is maximized by expanding the pool of future individuals, people who can experience pleasure, contribute knowledge, and achieve societal progress.
So a shrinking population then would be a massive utility deficit for the future.
Huge one. So it's not just that having children is good. It's that not having children today actively impairs the ability of future generations to reach their maximum potential and well-being.
Wow, it's an intergenerational responsibility then.
Exactly. Now, you contrast that with deontological ethics, which the sources also bring in. And deontology, it's not concerned with consequences like utilitarianism is. It's all about absolute moral duties.
So what's the absolute duty here?
The duty to preserve the species. If a moral action has to be universalizable, meaning everyone capable should do it, then the sources argue that contributing to the long-term survival of the human race becomes this fundamental, non-negotiable duty,
An end in itself.
paramount to any individual choice.
Yes. And this all reinforces that key structural point made across the source material. The natural family unit, mother, father, child, is seen as the indispensable.
The fundamental unit of civilization.
Right. It's the mechanism responsible for passing on knowledge, maintaining moral order, and preparing that next generation.
So if that structure is disrupted, or if, the participation rate in that structure declines, the sources conclude that you risk disrupting not just social stability, but the fundamental progression that the species needs to survive.
It really shifts the whole discussion from a personal choice to a collective functional obligation. Okay, so if we accept that ethical argument about continuity, where does biology take us? That sets us up nicely for segment 2, moving into the hard biological and demographic facts.
The sources are very, very direct here. From a strictly Darwinian standpoint, the functional purpose of sexual behavior is reproduction.
That's simple.
Evolutionary biology ensures that traits which enhance reproductive success are the ones that get selected. It pushes the species toward creating the maximal number of viable offspring.
So if you're using that purely functional lens, the sources argue that sexual behavior that doesn't result in viable offspring is, in evolutionary terms,
A dead end for the species. That's how this perspective frames it. Behavior that doesn't produce the ultimate biological outcome, reproduction, is judged as biologically counterintuitive.
incompatible with the foundational biological drive.
Yes, but the stakes, they become truly concrete when we transition from evolutionary theory to, modern demographics. The warnings in the source material are about existential threats, and they're backed by some really stark data.
On declining birth rates.
They really are.
Yeah.
The key concept here for you is replacement level fertility. It's often cited as 2.1 births per woman.
Right, and we should clarify why it's 2.1 and not just 2.0.
For sure.
Why the extra tenth of a person?
It's because you have to account for mortality, for the children who don't survive to reproductive age, and also for the fact that not every single person who's born will choose to or be able to reproduce. So you need that slight surplus just to keep the population stable.
And the research shows that many developed nations are falling way below that.
Dramatically below that 2.1 threshold, particularly in Europe and East Asia.
And the immediate consequences of this, they're not abstract at all, are they? We're talking about massive economic strain.
It's an arithmetic certainty. Modern economies, they rely on a large, young, working population supporting a smaller, aging population, especially in what we call pay-as-you-go systems.
Like public pensions and national health care.
Exactly. So when that ratio flips, when you have fewer young workers who have to support more retirees, you see declining productivity, rising public debt, and just massive funding crises.
And the sources, they cite Japan, Italy, and Germany as the big examples where this is already happening.
They do. Japan in particular is used as this dramatic, real-time case study of demographic decline.
And there's a specific data point they offer that is just chillin'.
Yeah. Japan's population was roughly 126 million in 2020. It's projected to crash down to 88 million by 2065.
That's a loss of nearly a third of the country.
A third of the human capital you need to maintain complex, modern infrastructure, innovation, defense, everything.
It's so hard to internalize the scale of that kind of loss. It's not just about pensions, it's the cumulative loss of, specialization, resilience.
And that leads to the ultimate conclusion that the sources draw, and they cite the UN and the London School of Economics here. Without sufficient population levels to maintain knowledge and innovation, the decline just becomes exponential.
So the long-term threat is framed as
A descent into societal collapse and ultimately the potential extinction of humanity.
So from this viewpoint, the demographic decline is basically empirical evidence. It suggests that if the ethical imperative is continuity and the biological imperative is procreation, then relationships that don't contribute to that are not just incompatible with religious doctrine.
They're seen as actively accelerating that endgame scenario for the species. It creates this profound sense of urgency around the duty to procreate, framing it as the essential action required to avert catastrophe.
Okay, now we have to address the scriptural foundation for this argument directly, particularly how the source materials handle non-procreative relationships. And we really have to underscore here that we are strictly and impartially presenting the interpretations and the content found within the sources themselves. We are not endorsing this.
Absolutely. This is where the theological and the ethical mandates really converge in the texts. The sources cite numerous scriptural references across the Abrahamic traditions to reinforce this incompatibility argument.
Starting with the Hebrew Bible.
Specifically, Leviticus 18.22, which instructs, "You shall not lie with a male as with a female. It is an abomination." And this passage is presented as establishing an early law that condemns same-sex acts as a violation of God's intended moral order.
And then moving into the New Testament, the sources reference Romans chapter 1.
Right, verses 26 and 27, where certain behaviors are described as unnatural and are associated with humanity turning away from God's design. And this is often interpreted in the sources as a comprehensive condemnation of acts outside that procreative purpose.
They also cite 1 Corinthians.
Yes, 1 Corinthians 6.9 to 10. It includes the phrase, "men who commit lewdness with mankind," in a list of behaviors that would preclude entry into the kingdom of God. So the sources emphasize that these texts view such acts as fundamentally disordered.
Contrasting them sharply with the institution of marriage, which is ordained for procreation.
Exactly. And in Islam, the sources cite the narrative of Lot, or Prophet Lut, found in the Quran and the Hadith. The destruction of the people of Sodom is presented as a divine punishment for specific acts, including same-sex relations, which are described as uniquely sinful because they violate that natural and moral order.
Now, to be fair to the scholarship, the sources do acknowledge that there is a debate about this.
They do. They mention that some contemporary scholars suggest these passages might be tied to specific ancient cultural practices like idolatry or exploitative behavior, rather than being an absolute universal condemnation of all same-sex acts.
That's a really important nuance to include, but the dominant interpretation that's utilized by these sources.
It remains focused on the incompatibility of these relationships with the core intended procreative design.
Which brings us to the final structural synthesis of the source material, this critical conflict between love and duty. In modern society, emotional fulfillment and love are, widely cited as the ultimate justification for same-sex relationships. But the sources argue that individual fulfillment, while valuable, is insufficient to meet the collective divine purpose.
That sounds like a clear prioritization of the species over the self.
It is. If we go back to that key Catholic Catechism citation, it states, "Marriage is ordered for the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children."
The "and" is doing a lot of work there.
It really is. The argument is that love must be, at the very least, integrated with that greater collective duty of sustaining the human population and maintaining moral order.
Through successful parenting.
So the core contradiction that the source material isolates for you, the listener, is this. The natural family structure is the fundamental cornerstone for continuity and stability. Therefore, relationships that, by their nature, cannot contribute to procreation, and thus may accelerate this documented demographic decline, are viewed as fundamentally incompatible with the ethical and biological necessity of sustaining the human species.
Which in turn renders them incompatible with what the sources call the ultimate divine intention of procreation. That is the inescapable conclusion drawn across all the different disciplinary arguments presented in this material.
Wow. This has been a deep and complex dive. To quickly summarize, we've navigated three interwoven, mutually reinforcing arguments presented in these sources. We have the theological mandate from Genesis, the secular ethical obligation rooted in societal continuity and a duty to the species, and finally, the biological necessity, which is underscored by these dire demographic warnings we see globally.
What this collection of sources ultimately communicates is that they frame procreation not as some individual option in a life plan, but as a collective moral obligation.
A necessary functional requirement.
Yes, for long-term human survival. They position non-procreative relationships as a potential factor in what they see as a looming existential threat.
And that framework, it leads us to a final provocative thought for you to carry forward and explore on your own.
Given the stark evidence presented regarding current declining birth rates, and acknowledging the dependence of our complex modern economies, especially their massive pension and healthcare systems, on continuous intergenerational support. If you were to completely set aside the theological and the moral arguments,
Just ignore them for a second.
does the demographic data alone compel a reevaluation of procreation as a shared necessary societal duty, regardless of anyone's personal belief?